The engine that won World War II and still won't die. In 1943, an American factory in Detroit was building one diesel engine every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Those engines went into tanks rolling across North Africa, into landing craft hitting the beaches at Normandy, and to Navy patrol boats hunting U-boats across the Atlantic. If the Allied war machine had a heartbeat, this was it. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Some of those exact engines are still running today. Not in museums, not behind velvet ropes, in fishing boats, in backup generators, in industrial equipment grinding through 12-hour shifts like it's still 1965. We're talking about engines pushing 80 years old that flatly refuse to quit. And the company that built them? It eventually walked away from everything that made them legendary. This is the story of Detroit Diesel, the Screaming Jimmy, and the engine that outlived the era that built it. To understand why Detroit Diesel mattered, you need to understand what diesel engines looked like in the late 1930s. They were enormous, slow-turning, massively heavy machines designed for ships, locomotives, and stationary power plants. Powerful, yes, but completely impractical for anything that needed to move quickly or fit into a tight space. Trucks, buses, military vehicles, none of them could use diesel power because diesel engines were simply too big, too heavy, and too expensive to produce at scale. General Motors saw the gap. What if you could take the toughness of diesel and shrink it into something that could be mass-produced on an automotive assembly line? Standardized components, interchangeable parts across an entire engine family. A modular platform that could scale from a 2-cylinder for light equipment all the way to a 16-cylinder for ships and armor. That idea became the Detroit Diesel Engine Division, founded in 1938. And the engine they built to prove the concept, the Series 71, was unlike anything the industry had seen before. Here's the engineering decision that made everything else possible, and it's the reason these engines sound the way they do. Pay attention to this part because it explains why diesel fans lose their minds over these things 50 years later. Most diesel engines operate on a 4-stroke cycle. Intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. 4 strokes of the piston to produce 1 power stroke. The Series 71 used a 2-stroke cycle. Every single revolution of the crankshaft produced a power stroke. That meant more power from a smaller, lighter block. Exactly what GM needed to prove the concept worked. But 2-stroke diesel engines have a fundamental problem. On a 4-stroke engine, 1 stroke is dedicated entirely to pushing exhaust gases out of the cylinder. On a 2-stroke, there's no dedicated exhaust stroke. The engine has to scavenge exhaust gases and pull in fresh air simultaneously, at the bottom of the same stroke. Do it wrong and the engine chokes on its own exhaust. Detroit Diesel's solution was a Roots-type supercharger, a mechanically driven blower mounted directly on the engine that continuously pushed fresh air through the cylinders, flushing out exhaust gases while charging the combustion chamber. It wasn't an optional performance upgrade. It was a structural requirement. The engine couldn't function without it. And that blower, that constant mechanical howl of pressurized air moving through an aluminum case at high speed, is exactly what gave the Series 71 its voice. Truckers called it the Screaming Jimmy. Once you've heard one at full throttle, you understand why the name stuck. It doesn't rumble, it doesn't thump, it screams, a high, mechanical wail that carries for miles and announces itself like nothing else on the road. That sound was about to become the soundtrack of World War II. When the United States entered the war in 1941, the military needed engines that were powerful, reliable, and, critically, repairable by a 19-year-old mechanic with basic tools in a field somewhere in Europe. Detroit Diesel had built exactly that. By 1943, the factory was producing over 57,000 Series 71 engines per year, one every 10 minutes, around the clock. They went into M4 Sherman tanks, into the DUKW amphibious vehicles that carried troops from ship to shore at Normandy and in the Pacific, into Navy PT boats, into generators powering field hospitals and command posts, into landing craft that delivered men onto beaches under fire. The Series 71's obsessive focus on field repairability wasn't accidental. It was designed in from the beginning. Unit injectors could be swapped individually without pulling the engine. The supercharger was mechanically driven and nearly bulletproof. Major components were accessible without removing the engine from the vehicle. A soldier with a wrench set and a parts kit could perform substantial repairs in conditions that would make a modern dealership technician quit on the spot. The wartime testing ground did something no laboratory ever could. It proved the engine under every extreme condition simultaneously. Desert heat in North Africa, Arctic cold in Northern Europe, saltwater corrosion in the Pacific, months of continuous operation with minimal maintenance. The Series 71 ran through all of it. When the war ended and the engines came home, Detroit Diesel had the most battle-tested product in the history of American manufacturing. The question was what to do with it next. The answer turned out to be everything. The post-war expansion of the Series 71 family is almost hard to believe in scope. The engine scaled from the compact 371 all the way up to the 24 V71, a 24-cylinder monster producing over 1,800 horsepower. The genius of the modular design meant that pistons, connecting rods, injectors, and hundreds of other components were interchangeable across the entire family. A parts manager who understood one Series 71 engine understood all of them. City buses got the 6V71, reliable enough for stop-and-go urban punishment, compact enough to fit under a floor without eating passenger space. Fire departments chose the 8V71 because they needed an engine that would start instantly at 3 in the morning, at full load, without hesitation. Marine operators installed everything from 6 to 71S in fishing boats to 16 V71S in commercial tugboats. Construction companies put them in bulldozers, cranes, and excavators because the two-stroke design produced maximum torque at barely above idle. You could lug one down to almost nothing and it would still pull. And then there was the Series 149 introduced in 1965, which represents two-stroke diesel technology taken to a place that borders on the irrational. Available in configurations up to 20 cylinders, over 3,000 horsepower. Used in open-pit mining haul trucks, draglines, and offshore vessels where the question wasn't fuel economy. It was whether anything could actually stop it. Often the answer was no. Through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, the Screaming Jimmy dominated American industry. The sound of a Detroit diesel at full throttle was the sound of the country running. Then the world started changing, and Detroit diesel's greatest strength started working against it. The two-stroke scavenging process that made the Series 71 so powerful had an unavoidable consequence. Some fuel passed through unburned on every cycle. In 1944, nobody cared. By 1975, with emissions regulations tightening, that characteristic was becoming a serious problem. You simply cannot make a two-stroke diesel as clean as a four-stroke. The physics don't allow it. Noise was the other issue. The Screaming Jimmy sound that truck drivers loved, that mechanical howl that announced a loaded Pete coming down a grade 2 miles before you could see it, was increasingly unwelcome in cities. Urban bus operators faced noise complaints. Residential communities along trucking corridors pushed back. You could not muffle a Detroit diesel two-stroke into silence. That was structurally impossible too. Meanwhile, Cummins and Caterpillar, four-stroke manufacturers from the beginning, were steadily improving their engines to be quieter, cleaner, and more fuel-efficient. They didn't have to reinvent themselves. They just had to keep improving what they already had. Detroit Diesel's response came in 1987 with the Series 60, a complete clean-sheet four-stroke engine with fully electronic fuel controls. It was a genuine departure from everything the company had built for 50 years, and it worked. Fleet operators found fuel economy 15 to 20% better than comparable engines. The Series 60 captured roughly a third of the North American heavy truck market by the early 1990s. But to get there, Detroit Diesel had to become a different company. In 1988, GM spun off the division into a joint venture with Penske. In 2000, Daimler Chrysler acquired it. The two-stroke engines that had built the brand were phased out one by one. The Screaming Jimmy went quiet. Officially anyway. Here's what nobody expected. The engines didn't care that production had ended. Series 71 engines are still running commercial fishing vessels off both coasts, still powering generators in hospitals, data centers, and remote industrial sites where the question isn't what's modern, it's what starts every single time. Still turning over in workboats and tugboats operated by people who have run them for 30 years and have no interest in replacing something that demonstrably works. The restoration community that's grown up around these engines is unlike anything else in the diesel world. Truck shows and diesel events across the country draw crowds around properly tuned Series 71S, that signature green paint, mechanical injection dialed in, the blower spinning up to speed. When one of these engines lights off at full throttle in an open field, people stop what they're doing. They just stop and listen. Parts availability for an engine that's been out of production for decades is remarkable. A thriving aftermarket has built up around injector rebuilds, supercharger overhauls, and hard parts that keep these engines turning. Specialists have built careers doing nothing but keeping screaming Jimmies alive. The knowledge hasn't died because the engines haven't died. There's a reason for that loyalty that goes beyond nostalgia. Modern diesel engines are extraordinarily capable, cleaner, more efficient, and more powerful than anything from the Series 71 era. They're also extraordinarily complex. Sensors, modules, proprietary diagnostic software, dealer-only calibration tools. When something goes wrong in a remote location, that complexity is not your friend. A Series 71 is the opposite of that. Everything is accessible. Everything is mechanical. A competent person with hand tools can perform a major overhaul without a laptop. That philosophy, build it robust, make it fixable, expect it to last, is what Detroit Diesel embedded in these engines in 1938, and it's why some of them are still earning their keep 80 years later. The factory that built one every 10 minutes to win a war is gone. The company that designed them belongs to a German conglomerate now. But on a fishing boat somewhere off the coast of Maine, or in a backup generator room in a hospital in the middle of the country, a screaming Jimmy is idling along, completely indifferent to all of that. It has a job to do. It intends to do it. If you want more stories about the machines, the engineers, and the decisions that built working America, this is your channel. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. See you in the next one.